Hi, y'all. It's Mr. Seidel. We're going to go over 4.2 Monopolies. This is our first virtual lesson. For my students, this is going to be a bit of a review, but for some of you who are watching at a different idea campus, or you may be watching on YouTube, my name is Mr. Seidel. I'm a econ and government teacher, and we're going to talk about monopolies today, right? So I want to tell you a story about before I lived where I live now. I used to live in this small town where there was only one grocery store, right? The closest grocery store or other grocery store was at least 45 minutes away, and you'd go and you'd pull into this small little grocery store, and I bet you can imagine what were the price of eggs, maybe about $5 a carton, $6 a carton, right? And that grocery store was the only option that people had to go and eat, and so, or to get fresh food. And so what did that grocery store do? Well, they raised their prices, right? That's what a monopoly is. A monopoly, right, is a market structure where there's only one firm. Down here in the Rio Grande Valley, you only have one option for internet access, and that's Spectrum. Okay, and so Spectrum is an example of a monopoly where if you're going to go get internet, unless you're getting it from your phone, if you want wired internet to your home, you got to go through Spectrum. So, what are some characteristics of monopolies? Well, with the monopoly, there's, like I said, the most important characteristic is that there's only one firm, one large firm. And the product is unique. The product is unique because, that's the only place to get it, right? With that grocery store example, although there's a lot of substitutes for eggs, I could drive 30 minutes to go get a different carton of eggs. There wasn't actually that option unless you were willing to drive that far, right? And so the product doesn't have to be completely unique. You just have to only be able to access it from one store, right? The next characteristic of a monopoly is high barriers. Firms can't enter the industry, right? The reason why there's only one store is because it's expensive to get into that business. The same reason why there's not a lot of internet service providers, right? Providing internet service is a really expensive service. And so, right, there would be more ISPs, more internet service providers, if it was cheaper to enter the business, right? And one funny story about that small grocery store in town, that family owned all the land outside of that around that town, right? And so Walmart or HEB would come in and they would say, no, we're doing great. We got this little monopoly at our store, right? Monopolies are price makers. That means that they can set their own price. If you don't have any choice to get internet access from Spectrum or go to the mini mart to get eggs, that store is going to control the prices that you spend, right? And then monopolies do engage in some advertising as well, right? Our next key point, why do monopolies exist? Monopolies exist simply due to high barriers to entry, right? High costs to get into the business, right? The electricity company in a lot of places where I'm from in Oregon, there's PG&E, they have a monopoly on it. Where we are, Spectrum, in Texas at least, Spectrum has a monopoly on internet service, right? If it was easy to become an internet service provider, if it was easy to become an electricity provider, right, there would be more electricity providers and there would be more internet service providers. So these high costs to enter the business prevent other businesses from entering and prevent competition from happening. And so usually what ends up happening, right, with my store example, is that the prices are too high and the quantity is too low. And I'll prove that to you looking at some supply and demand graphs in a second. But our next key point is, do monopolies ever benefit consumers? Sometimes monopolies can be beneficial to consumers. We call these monopolies natural monopolies. And the reason why they benefit consumers is these monopolies have to be large scale and they have to be expensive, right? I don't know if y'all remember, but we talked about economies of scale. As a business gets bigger, right, as they provide a larger quantity, their cost on average decreases, right? We have this economies of scale range. If our natural monopoly is producing an economies of scale and their costs go down and they pass those costs onto those savings onto the consumer, that would be a beneficial monopoly. That would be a natural monopoly. Now, it's that monopoly's choice whether they pass on the savings to those consumers or a lot of times they don't, right? But we call a natural monopoly a situation in which the company is so big, right? They're benefiting from economies of scale, and they pass those savings onto the consumers. That is the situation where monopolies benefit consumers. Rarely does this happen. Most of the time, monopolies are not beneficial to consumers. So we're going to look at the difference between a monopoly graph and perfect competition graph. Right? You might remember on the left-hand side, we have a perfect competition graph, a normal supply and demand graph, and I labeled in yellow, I labeled that equilibrium PE and QE. So we have an equilibrium price and we have an equilibrium quantity. On the right-hand side, we have a monopoly graph. Now, for my students, you've seen this a million times. For some other students, this might be new to you. But you'll notice if you look at this monopoly graph, it has two of the same features as perfect competition, right? It has supply, which, as you remember, is also equal to marginal cost. So my supply line on the right-hand side, on that right-hand side graph, right, we could replace that supply line with the Nike swoosh, the marginal cost line, right, and they'd be equal to each other just because this firm is not shutting down, right? It is not engaging in the shutdown rule. The price is above the average variable cost, and so marginal cost is equal to supply. And so that's one thing that monopolies and perfect competition have in common. They both have supply lines, and you'll notice that they both have demand lines. Now, if you haven't seen a monopoly graph, you're freaking out about that marginal revenue. What's that marginal revenue doing? Why is it going into the negative? We'll get to that in a second, right? But what I want you to notice is the marginal cost, which equals supply, and the demand line. Where they intersect, that would be the equilibrium, right? That would be the equilibrium price. That would be PE, and that would be QE. But the monopoly does not follow the price equilibrium or the quantity equilibrium. They follow the profit maximizing rule. And so if you look at that green line that I noted, that is where marginal cost and marginal revenue intersect. At this point in the course, you should know marginal cost, marginal revenue, where they intersect. What is that? Well, that's the profit maximizing rule. What's the goal of any business, regardless of its perfect competition or monopoly? Well, it's to make the most profit possible, right? And so the monopoly is going to produce where the MC and the MR intersect. I noted that quantity is QM. Now, what's interesting is the price is bumped up all the way up to the demand line because that's the highest price that people are willing to pay, right? This monopoly wants to make as much revenue as possible, and so what it does is it bumps the price up to the demand line, right? And that becomes the profit maximizing price and quantity for the monopoly. Well, if we look at that, the price is higher than the normal equilibrium, and the quantity is lower than the normal equilibrium. So those are our two problems with the monopoly, right? The first problem is that the prices are too high and the quantity is too low, right? I would go to that store, eggs would be $6, and there wouldn't be enough eggs for everybody, right? That is your problem with monopolies. Now we're going to draw out a monopoly, right? You saw the graph, right? And now I'm going to show you why it has that split marginal revenue and demand line, right? Excuse me. Now here's the good news about monopolies. In the monopoly, right, in perfect competition, in Unit 3, you were drawing side-by-side graphs, right? You were drawing the supply and demand line, and then you draw the firm to the right of that, right? The good news in a monopoly is that one graph is all that's needed because the monopoly is the industry. There's only one business in the market. There's only one business in the industry, and so the monopoly graph is all you need, right? All the cost curves that you learned in Unit 3, average total cost, average variable cost, average fixed cost, marginal cost, they are all identical in a monopoly. The marginal cost, marginal revenue line, where they intersect, that's still the profit maximizing rule, and the shutdown rule still applies. So all the things that you learned in Unit 3 still apply. You're just learning a new graph, and you're learning a new market structure. What is the main difference? The main difference is the demand and the marginal revenue are split, like you saw in the graph that I drew, right? The marginal revenue does not equal the price. And I'm going to prove to you why that is mathematically, okay? So imagine you go to the store and eggs are $11. Nobody's buying eggs. You're finding something else to eat. Let me move my face really quickly out of here, right? So when we go to the store, eggs are $11. Zero people are buying eggs, which means that the total revenue is $0, which means the marginal revenue is also 0. So what does the monopoly have to do? The monopoly has to lower its price. They lower its price down to $10. And one desperate person who really wants an omelet buys 1 carton of eggs. Now that business has made a total revenue of 10 and a marginal revenue of 10. Before, the revenue was 0, and now the revenue is 10, and so your marginal revenue, your additional revenue is $10. Well, what if the store wants to sell more eggs? What do they have to do? They have to lower the price again. But here's the deal. If I'm the desperate person paying $10 for a carton of eggs, right, they can't charge me 10 and then charge you 9. They have to lower the price for me and you as well, right? And so they lower the price to $9 an hour. I buy eggs, you buy eggs, which means their total revenue is now $18. Before, their total revenue was $10, so that means now their marginal revenue is $8. They want to sell more eggs, and so what do they have to do? They have to keep lowering the price. But then when they lower it for everyone else, they have to lower it for us as well. You don't go to any store where they sell you eggs for $10. You're charging, you get eggs for $10. You're getting eggs for $6, right? And so as they lower the price, you will notice something is happening. The price starts at $11, then $10, then $9, then $8, but the marginal revenue is decreasing faster, right? These numbers, the price and the marginal revenue, they're not equal to each other, right? And that's why we have that split marginal revenue and demand line, because the price and the marginal revenue aren't equal to each other. As they lower that price, right, they have to lower it for everybody else, which means that their revenue increases at a slower rate, which means their marginal revenue decreases. And so what is the main difference, right? The marginal revenue is simply less than demand, which is why you have that split demand and marginal revenue line. And then everything else stays the same. You have a marginal cost curve. Sometimes I'll draw them as the Nike swoosh, the MC. Sometimes I'll draw them as a simple supply line, right? But the only difference is that the demand and marginal revenue are split. We'll talk about in our next lesson why the marginal revenue eventually becomes negative. We'll also talk about why the demand and marginal revenue actually start at the same point, right? But for now, I just want you to practice drawing monopolies. I'll see you in the next video.